In certainly the treks that I've taken through the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, what you see pretty much is a land that seems to be fairly docile. If you lose concentration, you can get into a bit of trouble. But through the natural lay of this land, of this valley, it's really a remarkable place to traverse and a remarkable place to see, because it really is out of place in this region of Alaska, which is so heavily foliated that when you first see the valley, that it's almost like a scar on the land. It's just a place that's completely out of place. Well, the story of the Valley of 10,000 Smokes begins on June the 6th, 1912, with the eruption actually of a brand new volcano, Nova Rupta. Nova Rupta, which is a vent approximately 7 miles from Mount Katmai, which was one of the larger of the mountains in the area. Katmai imploded. The mountain fell in on itself between 17 and 1900 feet. It lost in elevation. The Nova Rupta volcano, it's nothing more than, as you look at it today, just a disk really in the earth, surrounded by lesser volcanoes and actually some sedimentary mountains also. Robert F. Griggs was the first person to ascend Katmai Pass and see the valley in 1916. He had visited the valley in 1915, but really he just spent his time up around the crater of Mount Katmai, having come in from Geographic Harbor, which was really to the north and east. He didn't experience the valley in that very first expedition out there. In 1916, he came from really old Katmai village, and he wandered up along Katmai drainage and up and over the pass, and for the very first time laid eyes really on the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. I have a 1922 edition. This is the field copy that I use when I go on my travels out into the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. This is by Robert F. Griggs. And in here, he talks really about the discovery of the 10,000 Smokes and his discovery of the steaming valley. And I'll read just a little bit about this because it talks about his very first views really of what to Griggs was a rather incredible scene. Discovery of the steaming valley. The sight that flashed into view as we surmounted the hillock was one of the most amazing visions ever beheld by mortal eye. The whole valley, as far as the eye could reach, was full of hundreds, no thousands, literally tens of thousands of smokes curling up from its fissured floor. The first glance was enough to assure us that we had stumbled into another Yellowstone park, unseen and unsuspected by white man and native alike until this hour. I had tried to keep my head and observe carefully, yet I exposed 2 films from my own precious roll in trying for pictures that I should have known were impossible. For a few moments we stood gaping at the awe-inspiring vision before us, then plunged down to get a nearer view. It was as though all the steam engines in the world, assembled together, had popped their safety valves at once and were letting off surplus steam in concert. This was Griggs' view of the valley as he entered it. And he talks a great deal about the difficulty in photographing the valley because, as I just read, how can you take 2 exposures of a place and really tell the whole story in photography, not only in 2 exposures, but in 2,000, it makes no difference. It gives you an idea of what the place looks like, but really to experience it, you need to go there and see it for yourself.
We don't know very much about what led up to the eruption, except that there were a lot of earthquakes. At that time, people were already starting to put seismic instruments in the ground. There was, I think the closest ones were in Fairbanks, Alaska, and Vancouver, British Columbia. So there were some pretty large earthquakes, magnitude 6, enough that an astute volcanologist would suspect that something bigger than normal was coming by way of an eruption. We also know that the native people in the area more or less auto-evacuated because they felt these earthquakes. They also got the sense that something dangerous was going to happen.
They thought it was the end of the world because there was lightning and earth shaking, and like Father Harry said, the older people probably, he said what he recalls is in Katmai, the older people said, fill up your containers with water and turn your bidarkies over. But what she has told me was that it was so frightening that American Pete, who was the chief of the Savanoski village, had gathered everybody up, and he had been out of the village, but he came back and gathered everybody up and told them that they had to leave because it was really too bad. They couldn't see their hands in front of them. They just had to paddle down in their bidarkies. And Grandma described that there were big rocks, like rocks of fire, that fell. So I assume that it's probably the big pumice stone. I've seen some that are just huge, so I can imagine how frightening that must have been.
The eruption was first sighted about noon 1912 by a ship, the Dora, in Shelikof Strait. It was perfectly clear that day. And people on the ship saw the eruption column go to probably, we would estimate on the basis of the deposits, 100,000 feet. So 3 times the altitude at which passenger jet aircraft fly. It lasted about 2.5 days, ejecting about 30 cubic kilometers of pumice and ash. That's about 5 boxes a mile on a side, so a huge amount of material. And much of that came out during the first 12 hours, that is by midnight on June 6th. And it came out in 2 ways. Part went up very high into the stratosphere in a huge cloud that began raining ash, of course in the local area, but also in Kodiak, the ash accumulated to a depth of about 1 foot, which is a lot of ash. And this is 1 foot of rock, not 1 foot of snow, so it did considerable damage. The other half of the volume actually formed pyroclastic flows that are they're dense clouds that race out from the vent, depositing a mixture of pumice and ash. They're turbulent clouds. Closest analogy would be like a snow avalanche. And you don't really see the avalanche in a snow avalanche. You see the billowy snow coming off of it. But at the base of that is a jumble of blocks of snow and so on, moving at very high velocity. A series of those came down this broad glacial valley and gradually build up a deposit that's maybe as much as 1,000 feet thick in the upper valley and about 100 feet thick in the lower valley. By the time they got out that far from the vent, about 12 or 15 miles, they were moving fairly slowly, and they banked up against a terminal moraine there. Now that kind of cloud retains most of the heat. of the eruption because it doesn't go up high into the atmosphere and mix with air. And so it was very, very hot. And of course, it was very thick, and rocks don't conduct heat very well. So that part of the deposit stayed at high temperature, almost at melting point for years. And meanwhile, there was a tremendous amount of water surging in off the glaciers because hot material was falling on the glaciers. It rains a lot there. There was snow because it's early June. You had snow melting, flushing water into the valley. So all the water there was all the water normally going through the valley, plus a lot more because of all these hot deposits, and water coming in contact with this thick slab of hot rock set up basically boiling systems where the water would boil to steam, come up through cracks in the rock. Hot steam can transport metals, and that came up to the surface of this deposit where it cooled, where the steam would hit the cold near surface environment, dump all those metals. So what you ended up with was a valley of 10,000 smokes, a flat plateau of thick ash with everywhere fumarole steam vents depositing all kinds of brightly colored metallic minerals.
I was a student in college in 1966 and unsure of what direction I wanted to go in until I was drafted in 1968. I spent 2 years in Vietnam, and I would take leave, and on my leave I would go oftentimes to China, Japan, the Philippines. And I remember distinctly on one of my travels of going to Japan, of going to Tokyo and taking a bullet train south to Kyoto, and just wandering the city, and all of a sudden coming upon several actually Zen gardens. And one of them, the Ryanji Garden, really struck me as an absolutely beautiful place, and I realized that it was the complete opposite of the activity that I had experienced in the war. That it was a way to sort of balance my life a little bit, and looking at these gardens, they were predominantly stones surrounded by sand, and I would go and sit with these for several hours. I would leave and I would come back the next day, and the stones remained. The sand had been moved and changed. It had been raked into a different direction, but it created a real peaceful feeling. In 1980, I decided to move to Alaska. I had just completed my education at the University of Iowa, and when I first got to Alaska, and I experienced the tides, and I noticed these stones had a similarity to the stones of the Ryanji Garden. That the sands would pick up little bits of debris and movement, but the stones stayed the same, and I spent the better part of probably 10 years photographing these things. The first 2 years in Sitka, I had an exhibition of work, and the National Park Service people in Sitka saw my photographs and made a comparison between them and also the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, and I realized at that time, in order to satisfy myself, one day I'd have to travel there. The actual travel to the valley didn't come until 20 years after my move to Alaska. And thinking back to the photography that I did, much of it has its basis in these photographs that I did of the tidal areas, and certainly going back to the Ryanji Garden. When I went into the valley, I carried usually 120 rolls of 120 film with me. And on the average, I would expose nearly 90 to 100 rolls of film when I was out there. It's a lot of weight to have to carry, along with the camera and a tripod. I would take the film back and take it to my darkroom studio area, and it would take me several days, actually nearly 2 weeks, to do the developing of the film. Then I would hang it, dry it, cut it up, and store it. And when the time came to get into the darkroom, I would remove the film from storage, and I would go ahead and put it into a carrier, put the carrier into the enlarger, and then begin the work, certainly in the darkroom. Oftentimes, again, I've been working in the darkroom with these images for 6 years, and I'm still not through all of the negatives. That it's a long process. There are certain things, certainly going back to my notes as I look through them, that for some reason call me into the darkroom. Specific images, specific ideas that I have, and I'll go look in certain days and I'll find those images, and that's what I'll end up working with. These are really the bits and pieces of spending all of this time in the valley that the longer I stayed there, the more sensitive I became to my surroundings and the more observant I would become. Specific images would certainly seem to stand out, and those tend to be the ones that I've worked with. Over this period, I know there's a lot more in there, and there's a lot more left to be done out there, and I guess that's part of the problem I've had in photography in this place is how can I possibly photograph a 44 square mile place and the surrounding mountains and come back with anything that has substance to it? Something that tells the story of the place, but also balances my life, as I've talked in the past, that really tells a little bit of a story of what is important to me, and hopefully some of these ideas become important to other people. That wilderness is, from my perspective, a really cherished place. It's a really important element in my life, and I think to many of the people who live in Alaska, they live in it, they live around it, and they take advantage of it by spending as much time as possible outdoors. Most of the people that live there that are truly happy there are outdoor people. And essentially in my photography, that's what I'm attempting to do really in the creation of these images. This image is taken at 6 Mile. It's of the Buttress Range, just on the south side of the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And what you're looking at are striations really of sedimentary rock. And it's quite dark and almost gloomy. It had rained the night before rather heavily, and in the morning the sun was beginning to come up, but prior to getting into its deep intensity, that is in brightness, it was there just long enough to really warm the scene and allow really some of this steam to begin to form really along the top part of this range. The stones are dark. That is, I should say, the range itself is dark. It's striated, and just the patterns and the feeling of steam that emanates from the top part of it created something that I thought was visually pretty fascinating. As I came up over the pass between Broken Mountain and Baked Mountain, standing in Pea Soup Pass, this is what I saw in looking down at my first sighting of Nova Rupta, its dome plug, that is. This is the circular dome. This is the center really of what the Valley of 10,000 Smokes is all about. It's really the altar of Katmai that you're looking at here, the center of it all. The explosion emanated from this particular place. It's a brand new volcano. And when it came into being, it blew off half the mountain in the distance right behind it, which is Falling Mountain. And if you look carefully beyond the summit really of Falling Mountain, up in the clouds you'll see the summit of Mount McGeek, which is also a large active volcano, and behind that is Mount Martin. I think part of the appeal of going out to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, as I think back on it, is what it's like to be alone in the valley. That I remember on occasions of being flown into the valley by Cecil Schumann, who owns Sea Air out of King Salmon. He would load all the gear into the aircraft and he would fly me out there, and it was a good 45-minute flight from civilization. He would land on the pyroclastic flows out there. We would unload all of the gear. We'd make an arrangement for when he was to return to pick me up, and then he would take off. And it's an interesting situation of what it's like to be standing there in the middle of this wilderness and to watch your only link to civilization leave. And all of a sudden it would sort of sink in that here I am, I'm alone in this place. That I have no radios with me, I have no means of communication whatsoever. My contact is left. There is a sense of apprehension and a sense of anxiety that sets in for just a short period of time. But I realized that after putting my pack on and climbing the 300 feet that it took to get up to the geologist shelters on Baked Mountain, that just the stress and the strain of being back out there and trying to carry loads of gear, equipment, food, and all the items that I would need to keep me there for the better part of 2 weeks. That began to take precedence over the idea of being alone. As a matter of fact, I would often think that the first day or day and a half that I was in the valley, that I would just use that time to sort of get myself situated there. That I wanted to sort of come to an understanding with the rhythm of the place. And certainly in June, when you're in the valley that far in the northern latitudes, you realize that the sun will set, but it doesn't get dark. It stays light, so there's no darkness that seems to set in out there, which in a sense is quite nice because I can wander about the valley anytime, day and night, and not be concerned for carrying flashlights or any other paraphernalia that I would need at that time. But I think of bigger consequences that it takes a while to get used to something because it's an environment that really is unknown in a sense. That certainly every time that I go back to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, I become a little more familiar with it. These are the USGS Bake Mountain shelters, and they consist of 3 buildings. One primarily a bunkhouse, the second is a cook's shelter and also a bunkhouse, and the third is a tool shed that houses most of the tools used by the geologists as they work up in this area. The most palatial of the 3 structures actually up at Bake Mountain is this one, which really consists of 4 bunks. There are 3 that are stacked up and then one that's directly behind me. In addition, we've got a nice table in which you can cook and spread out some of the materials really that you'll need. Also a cabinet that's loaded up with reading material and other things to make your stay at Bake Mountain a lot more comfortable. I've been to the Valley of 10,000 Smokes 4 times. The first time I stayed in a tent down near 6 Mile and wandered up toward these shelters and really had the opportunity to check them out for the first time. The second time and the third time, I spent a great deal of time in these shelters and found after walking the 9 miles from Windy Creek and through the passage of the creek and the up and down escarpment and so forth, and the final 300 to 500 foot climb, that these shelters look mighty good when you finally arrive. It's a fairly comfortable place. They're always sort of in need of repair, but at the same time they certainly keep the wind and most certainly all of the pumice that flies through the air when the winds come up. It does a wonderful job to keep you sheltered. There's no warmth, as you can see. I'm sitting here and it's a day probably 45 degrees, so it's rather cool out, but the shelters do certainly keep the elements away from you outside of the cold. I spent a great deal of time here in 2004 when I came up alone for the better part of 9 days. I was here, and out of that period of time, 4 of the days were pretty much entirely ensconced in this shelter. And primarily it was due to weather, an awful lot of wind where the shelter would actually shake, the windows would rattle, but at the same time it was wonderful to be here rather than be in a tent where I'd be constantly having to reset it and the shaking that would certainly go on because of the high winds. Also, it's a great place to contemplate, to read. There's plenty of light that comes in from the 2 windows that we have. When I leave this place, these windows will be covered from the outside. There are boards that are on hinges that will cover them up to protect them a little bit, but as the traveler gets here, you go ahead and open it up and it allows at least semi-clear plastic to illuminate the interior of it. This window that's over the top of the cook's table, as I sit here I can see Bake Mountain, at least the lower flanks of Bake Mountain, and it's just a wonderful place to relax and look at what's going on into the valley. I think back on some of the work, and I think that as I've been out in the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, again, I've spent over the period of 8 years really only 6 weeks out there. And in that period of time, I mean, that's just minuscule in regard to the greater expanse of the 8 years that I've been thinking about and working in this project. That again, I deal with the anticipation of going out there. And once I'm there, the difficulties and the hardship of being there and carrying the equipment through the valley, I think sometimes I even question myself, is this worth it? Am I getting really or recording what I really want to see in this place? It's only when I come back from my travels through this environment and begin to work with these images and reflect back on what I've done that all of a sudden the importance of what I did while I was out there really comes home to me. I've had the opportunity now for several years to be working in the studio, and each day that I go into my studio and begin to work on these images, it takes me exactly back to that moment in time. And am I able to capture that? And it's only in coming back with these images and working with them that I finally come to a conclusion that yes, this indeed is worth every moment of time that I've spent out there. The images themselves seem to convey a sense that make this place a truly unique area in the world. And this is essentially the reason I keep going back to it.